Today I'm going to be talking about the Canon R8, which I've now been using for the last 8 months or so. Now I don't intend this to be a full-blown review. I'm not going to go through all of its features, functions and specifications. Instead, I'm going to be giving you my real-world experiences of the camera, but purely concentrating on photography. I'm not going to be talking about video as I don't do much videoing. However, I will be recording the main footage of this video on the R8. So, if any of that interests you, then please stick around. Now then, good to be with you all again. I had actually intended to do this video at around the 3-month point of owning the camera, but I then injured my hand to the point where I had to have an operation which put me out of photography for a few months or so. And even after that, it's been a gradual process getting back to being able to handle a camera. Now, somewhat ironically, this actually reinforced my main reason for getting the R8, and that was I simply wanted a smaller, lighter full-frame mirrorless camera to replace my original EOS R. Something I could use as an everyday carry, for travel, or just any occasion when I wanted to travel lighter. But it also had to be capable of working alongside my Canon R5 as my secondary camera. And at only 461 grams, the R8 is certainly light, and possibly the lightest full-frame mirrorless that actually has a viewfinder. It's even slightly lighter than the original RP, whose compact body the R8 largely inherits. And when paired with some of the smaller primes like the RF28, 35 or 50mm, it makes for a very discreet and light setup, which has been extremely useful during my rehab, as I've been able to operate the camera in this guise largely with one hand during walkabouts. And the combination with the RF28mm is even small enough to fit into a pocket, well, a reasonably sized pocket that is. But it's no good just having a small light camera, it also needs to be capable of doing the job, and the R8 certainly ticks the box here. And that's because it shares so much with its bigger sibling, the R6 Mark II, which is usually about £1,000 more expensive here in the UK. It has the same 24 megapixel sensor. This provides great dynamic range and proved itself for this image where, even though I bracketed for the shot, I found that I was still able to use just one of the images and pull out the shadows and reduce the highlights in post-production. Interestingly, I also shot with the R5 on the same evening, and other than the resolution, there's nothing to choose between the two in terms of image quality. And it has great noise handling at higher ISOs, which is just slightly better than the R5. The R8 also shares the same Digic-X processor, which brings many of the same functions of the R6 II to the R8, such as the high frequency anti-flicker, which allows you to set a more granular shutter speed to cater for artificial light flicker. And it shares essentially the same focusing system, which is also found on the R3. And this includes all the improved subject detect modes, including auto mode. And due to my hand injury for some of the school performance shoots I do, I even operated the R8 as my second camera remotely on a tripod using a wireless trigger. And the subject detect focusing was just brilliant. The R8 also benefits from being able to use subject detect across all focusing modes and not just the whole area mode as it is on the R5, which all in all means that the R8 is a very small, very light but highly capable camera. I have no hesitation in using the R8 and R5 together and interchanging between the two as the need arises. Exactly what I was after. Some of the things I like with the R8 include how much easier it is to use the wireless remote I mentioned earlier compared with the original R or R5. I often use Canon's BRE1 wireless remote, but with the original R and R5 you have to first set the camera to the 2-second timer every time you want to use it, which is a bit faffy and unintuitive, especially as it doesn't then employ a 2-second timer. And of course you then have to remember to revert the camera back to the required shooting modes afterwards. With the R8 the remote just works in whatever shooting mode you're in, be it single shot or burst mode, etc. One slight quirk though is that you need to hold the remote or even the shutter button continually down when in burst mode when using the exposure bracketing feature. However, if you set the R8 to a 2-second timer and then use the remote alongside the exposure bracketing feature, the camera will automatically employ a burst mode for the required number of shots in the sequence, just as it does in the R and R5, because of course the remotes only work for those cameras when you set them to a 2-second timer. Another positive is that you can now assign a shutter sound when using the fully electronic shutter. Now, I've never been keen on shooting in fully silent mode, especially shooting bursts due to the lack of feedback. So it's great that you can now assign a volume from silent, 0, through a very faint click, which is barely audible to anyone but the user, to a louder chirp. But this then brings me onto some of the negatives or even quirks of the R8. Before you can actually get access to this volume menu, you have to first ensure that the beep function is turned on. If it's disabled, then the volume item will be greyed out. Now the beep is something I normally turn off, so I had to turn it back on. However, once in the volume menu, one of the things that can be adjusted is the focus beep, including setting it to 0, which is effectively off. Now, why Canon choose to have a feature control through two different areas is beyond me, but they've also done this with silent shooting. You can now set it through the volume menu and set the shutter volume to 0, or you can set silent shooting through camera menu 7, but they're independent of each other. If you go back into volume after enabling silent shooting through camera menu 7, the volume is still shown there at whatever you set it at. It's not set to 0. And perhaps this duplicated approach is why you can't apply the shutter volume that you've set to a function button or even to the Q screen. With the R8 and newer Canons, you can now customize the Q screen to add a selection of functions, including silent shooting on/off. But only total silent shooting is available as an option. You can't apply, as I said, the electronic shutter with a set volume level. The only way you can have quick access to electronic shooting with a set volume is to apply it to one of the two custom modes. Thankfully, these are independent of whether you're in stills or video shooting mode, so you get 2 each for stills and video. The R8 though does have some bigger limitations and misses out on some key features, no doubt in order to keep the size, weight and price down. For example, it lacks IBIS, has only one card slot. It doesn't have a mechanical shutter, relying instead on fully electronic and electronic first curtain shooting, and misses out on the curtain closing when powered off, a feature I've particularly liked on my R and R5, especially when changing lenses outdoors. And it uses the smaller LPE17 batteries instead of the larger LPE6NH batteries as used in the R5, 6s and 7, which are roughly twice the capacity of the smaller batteries. Which means you're going to need twice as many of the smaller batteries and change them more frequently to get the same usage as cameras with the larger battery. Now for me personally, having to have more of the smaller batteries in itself isn't too much of an issue, as two of the smaller batteries when put together aren't that much bigger nor that much heavier than a single larger battery, and they're considerably cheaper. Yes, I know you can get cheaper third-party batteries as well, but you are going to have to change the batteries more frequently. And for me, this is where the main problem lies, due to the lack of meaningful battery management information to help you decide when to change the battery. If you go into the battery section of the menu, you'll find that there's a battery level indicator which has 3 segments, the first of which occupies half of the gauge. However, many incorrectly assume that when this first segment is extinguished, that there's still 50% charge remaining, and are then dismayed when the battery becomes fully depleted shortly thereafter. Now the R8's manual defines the various stages of the indicator as thus: all indicators lit, battery level is sufficient. 2 indicators lit, which is when it looks as if the battery is half empty, battery level is low, but camera can still be used. 1 indicator lit, battery will be exhausted soon, blinks. No indicators lit, charge battery. Now if you compare this display to say the R5 or the original R, you'll see that both of these cameras also show the percentage charge of battery remaining. Additionally, the actual step points on the battery level indicator on these cameras also relate to a specific percentage range of charge remaining. And there are more step points, all of which is far more helpful. So as you see, the battery management information on the R8 is extremely limited. You have to more or less gamble as to when to change the battery. For information on my first outing shooting a school performance, I got about 550 shots on the R8 before I noted the blinking, which I didn't think was too bad, considering that I'd been doing an awful lot of reviewing on images as it was the first outing. Another couple of missing items on the R8 are the rear scroll wheel and joystick button, both of which I've enjoyed using on Canons ever since my original 5D days. And the joystick is great for navigating around your focus points. However, the R8, like other Canon R cameras, allows you to set up the touch to drag option, where you can use your thumb on the rear screen, like a trackpad, whilst the camera is up to your eye in order to move the focus points. And whilst this generally works really well, I often find that when I lift my thumb away from the screen, the focus point sometimes moves slightly. So the joystick is still way better for finer control. To get the same level of control on the R8, you can however use the 4-way pad. But out of the box, the camera is set up so that you have to first press this button before you can do this. And after every shutter press, even half press, you then have to press the button again. However, this is easily remedied by customizing the 4-way buttons from the default auto setting to direct AF selection. You'll then find that you can move the focus point with these controls without first having to press the other button. And even after changing from the default auto setting, the 4-way buttons can still be used as you would expect within menus, etc. There is one problem though that I have come across of changing to direct AF select, and that is it's very easy to catch a button with the lower ball of your thumb when gripping the camera. You can soon find that the focus point has gone to some errant position if you're not careful, and you can be left wondering where it's gone, especially if using small single point selection. And maybe this is reason enough for some to leave the 4-way button function set to auto. For myself though, I prefer the ease and flexibility that the button change brings. Another implication though of the missing joystick button is when using subject detect and you want to move from one eye or subject to another within the scene. With the R5 and others that have the joystick, it's a simple matter of flicking the joystick left or right to move between subjects. With the R8, a new facility, tap to move subject has been made available, which you have to first set in the menu. And this works by you tapping on the left or right side of the active area of the rear screen whilst looking through the viewfinder in order to move left and right between subjects. However, this feature can't be used whilst touch to drag is also enabled in the menu, or so the manual says. One thing I've found is that even with touch to drag enabled, provided you're in whole area focus mode, that the chevrons will appear against the subject box and you can then use the left and right buttons to move between subjects. Of course, if you haven't customised the 4-way buttons to direct AF select, you'll still have to press the other button first. As I mentioned earlier, the R8 lacks a fully mechanical shutter, relying instead on first curtain electronic and fully electronic shooting. Now, I don't propose to go through all the pros and cons of the various shutter modes here. What I can say, however, is that I've experienced no problems due to the lack of a mechanical shutter. But of course, your needs might differ. That said, there are some specific considerations to note regarding these modes on the R8. And these relate to the various limitations of maximum shutter speed and burst rates when using either first curtain electronic as opposed to fully electronic shutters. Generally speaking, you can go faster and higher in fully electronic shooting. And whilst it's great to be able to shoot at 20 or 40 frames a second, I do wish that there was also an option to have, say, 10 or 12 frames per second on the R8 when shooting electronically. For me, this would be more manageable and also mean that the buffer wouldn't fill up as quickly as it does at the higher rates. But of course, if you shoot fully electronic, you will experience some rolling shutter whilst panning. Body-wise, as I stated earlier, the R8 is effectively that of the RP though, with some switch changes as adopted in the R6 too. The on-off switch now moves over to the right and also incorporates a customisable lock function. And the old on-off position, as was on the RP, is now a dedicated video still selector switch. Though this change for me is taking some getting used to, having been so used to having the on-off switch on the left ever since my Canon 5D Mark III days. Even when using the correct switch to turn the camera on or off, I often find that all I've done is move it into the lock mode. Also, the on-off position has now flipped compared to the R and R5. Now, one of the limitations of the small form factor is that the grip is smaller. Whilst it's generally comfortable, if you have larger hands, your little finger will be left dangling with nothing to hold onto, and if you strap on a larger lens, the camera can become front heavy. Obviously, when you support the lens with your left hand, things are a lot easier. Having said all that, even though the grip isn't as long as I'd like, it hasn't caused me any undue problems even when using my RF70-200 2.8. I normally just curl my little finger underneath the camera base and things have been fine. There is the optional small extension grip originally made for the RP that only adds 85 grams in weight, which might improve things slightly, although this doesn't take any batteries. As the R8 is billed as an entry-level camera, it naturally includes some basic modes such as a couple of auto modes, scene modes and a creative filter mode, as well as all the other standard modes. It also has the ability to show a simplified interface for less experienced users, though I haven't tried any of these. Another area where cost savings have been made on the R8 is with the viewfinder and rear screen. These aren't the highest resolutions available to other Canons and for the most part won't be that noticeable until, that is, you want to check focus. But of course, those higher resolutions may well incur a higher drain on that small battery. Another negative with the R8, for me at least, is the multifunction button, which is located at the front here. It provides quick access to a number of functions and can be customised as to what is made available and their position. But I have to say, I'm not that enamoured with the current workings of this button on the R8, which is the same as that on the R6 II. And that's because when you press the button, you now get 2 rows of functions to navigate as opposed to just one on the R and R5. It looks cluttered with 2 rows and the navigation is now a lot clumsier. On the older cameras, using the rear selector wheel allowed you to go forwards or backwards to select the function of choice. Then, using the front selector wheel, you change the value of the chosen function. Simple. But on the R8 and other new Canons with the double row of functions, you're now restricted to only being able to use the multifunction button itself to move between the functions. You can't go backwards. You have to keep pressing the button to cycle through the functions until you loop round to the beginning. Then, having landed on the required function, the front dial now changes the value for the top row function, whilst the rear dial changes the value for the bottom row function. I constantly find myself using the wrong dial, changing the bottom row values when it's a top row function I want to change, and vice versa. I think what was a very simple, usable solution has now been made overcomplicated. Another limitation of the R8, for me at least, is the inability to set a custom file name. This is a feature that I've made extensive use of on all my other Canon cameras. It's allowed me to set up a naming prefix to match the camera used so that, at a glance, whenever I see the file name once imported, I know the camera that was used to take the shot. Of course, you can set Lightroom up to customise the file name during import, but it's another workflow step. And if you use multiple cameras, you also have to remember to change the setting for each import for each camera used. I'd much rather it be done in camera and be done with it. So, what are my final thoughts on the R8 and who's it for? Who should buy it? Well, without doubt, despite it missing some key features and having some limitations, probably even more than I've gone through here, the R8 is still a great little camera. It's a highly versatile camera that any photographer of virtually any ability and need could potentially make use of with its mix of basic and more advanced features. Less experienced photographers will find that as they become more proficient, they won't unnecessarily need to upgrade. They'll find that the camera can grow with them, as they'll be able to move on to the R8's more advanced features. And because of these advanced features, courtesy of the R6 II, existing R system users like myself, who are seeking to add a cheaper but smaller full-frame R system camera to their setup, could find this a very compelling option. However, it's more than likely that such users would then end up using 2 battery systems, which for some might be reason enough not to get the R8. Now, whilst using 2 battery systems hasn't caused me any real problems, though I have bought one of these dual chargers to simplify things, I'd much rather use a single system, especially as I've got stacks of these older LP6 batteries. And whilst you can't get the faster burst rates out of the R5 with some of these, they're still great to have as spares and work for most of what I need. So, to avoid unnecessarily investing in a stack of smaller batteries, which will only have to be swapped out later on, individuals seeking to get the R8 as a stepping stone into the full-frame R ecosystem might be better off considering other R system options from the outset which utilise the larger battery and are usually available cheaper than the R8 either new or used. For example, if you engage in more static subject matter such as landscapes or portraiture, then the original R is still a very capable camera and in my opinion has better ergonomics than the R8. It also has a slightly higher resolution. And if you shoot more dynamic subjects or are seeking to get into the wedding market, then the original R6 is an absolutely superb camera. And as well as having the larger battery, this has all the things that are missing from the R8 that we've been discussing, such as IBIS, twin card slots, a fully mechanical shutter, rear scroll wheel and the joystick button. And for many seeking to add a cheaper full frame body to their setup, this is probably going to be the more logical choice. Now, whilst I haven't gone into video here, largely because I don't feel qualified enough to do so, virtually all the reviews I've seen on the camera have extolled its video capabilities. Some of the advantages of the R8 in this area include dispensing with the 30-minute limitation, and so if you're a hybrid shooter, the R8's video capabilities might be worth exploring and might swing the decision for you. However, I do know that some have also expressed concern regarding overheating during long shoots, and of course there's still the question of that small battery, which some will find just too limiting. But for me, perhaps the main reason to consider the R8 is the combination of its size and weight along with its overall capabilities. It's a feature-packed camera which is great as an everyday carry and travel camera, especially when paired with smaller primes. But it's also useful to have when you just want to lighten the load. And as it is so small and light, I'll normally have it with me in any case alongside my R5. And as I hate changing lenses, especially when outdoors, I'll normally have a lens strapped to each and happily swap between the two cameras without any consideration, other than resolution, of missing out on any performance. I have to say that the R8 very nicely complements my R5. It has its own role to play, but it can also pick up the slack when needed. I only wish it had the larger battery. Well, I hope that's been of use to some of you. Until next time, thank you ever so much for watching. Take care. TTFN. Ta-ta for now. Now normally you'll be asked to like and subscribe or tickle my bell, but for me personally it matters not whether you do or don't. This channel's not sponsored, it's not monetized, I'm not chasing the YouTube algorithm. I do this purely for fun and to pass on information to others. If however you think the information is worthy to be seen by others, then a like could potentially get it in front of them. But do as you please.